Oh, yeah. How long have you been in Washington?
I moved to Washington at the end of March.
Oh,
I
okay.
work in Taiwan's TV station for the past 6 years.
Oh,
I'm a
okay.
Taiwanese.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay. So you've only just moved to Phoenix.
Yeah. But I live in Boston for the past few months.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So you didn't travel
My
up
brother
from Washington?
studied in Harvard
Oh.
Medical School. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, very cool.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So look
it's
at
a-
you when we film this.
Oh, you can just look at me. Right?
Yep.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So it's a great pleasure for welcome Professor Sach to join us and to share his insights. And right now, first of all, we all knew that Trump posted on October 10th that he might impose an additional 100% tariff on imports from China starting next month. But less than 48 hours later, he posted again and saying that he only wants to help China, not hurt it. And meanwhile, U.S. Trade Representative Greer said the 100% tariff depends on China's next move. So how should we view this kind of dramatic shift, this kind of back and forth within the Trump administration?
Well, I think a lot of it is bargaining chips for the possible meeting between President Trump and President Xi Jinping if they meet in Korea. And it very much reflects, I think, President Trump's attitude. He's unpredictable. That's part of the problem. So it's very difficult to gauge a strategic response when one day he may say X, the next day he may say Y. I think there's two things, though, which are significant. The first is that President Trump tends to deal with threats. You know, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And sometimes he does, but often he backs away. But I think the second important thing with President Trump is he really believes in the kind of personal aspect of negotiations. Because after all, what he really wants is a deal. He's a deal maker. He talks about that himself. So I think he sees really his relationship with Xi Jinping as being the most important element in trying to bring some kind of conclusion to the somewhat negative back and forth which has been going on. Both sides have really upped the pressure on the other in recent weeks to a point where if they were implemented, it would be crippling for the world, it would be crippling for the US, and it would be crippling for China. So one has to hope that perhaps sanity will prevail in this situation.
But what do you think the motivation behind the White House, like to make a deal with China, or to make the U.S. being more powerful on the global economy?
That's a really good question, and I think we don't really know which President Trump will turn up. Is it the deal maker, or is it the president who really wants to squash China and make sure America maintains its supremacy? And I think there's tensions within the Republican Party on that question. I think probably President Trump is likely to be more flexible. If he can get a deal he can announce, he'll say it's wonderful, the best deal ever made. However, as we know, a number of the people in his administration are extremely hostile towards China. They really do see China as the major threat to American global power. And I think they will keep pushing for harsher restrictions and measures against China.
But do you think this kind of policies shift frequently? Does it undermine the credibility of the negotiations right now, ongoing negotiations right now?
It's hard to say whether it undermines. I think both sides are behaving in a way that makes the negotiations tougher. But I think both sides probably recognize that in the end, some kind of compromise has to be made. And so I think both at the moment are posturing. America is not doing any favors with its threats of huge tariffs. China's recent activities around export controls on rare earths somewhat undermines its claims that it now is the responsible global partner. And we're seeing backlash from that, not just from America, but European Union and other countries. So, you know, both countries are getting themselves into a place where they're receiving criticism from much of the rest of the world, and some kind of climb down will have to be achieved. And that can really only be achieved if the two presidents meet and conclude some kind of framework for an agreement.
Yes. So you mentioned about rare earths, and we all knew that China announced suddenly that it will expand export controls on rare earths materials, and according to Secretary Bessent and also the U.S. Trade Representative Greer, that this is what they call a global supply chain power grab. So does this suggest that China has begun using critical resources as some kind of policy weapons, and do you think that will really work?
I think there's no doubt they're using it as a policy weapon. I think they've learned from America, which of course put the ban on exports of certain chips, that you can try and hold a country to ransom through that. I think China recognizes rare earths as its one really powerful tool, and it's sort of throwing that into the mix to try and force, I think, America to come to a bargaining position. But as I said earlier, I think it does damage China's reputation globally, because it could severely disrupt global supply chains. I suspect neither President Trump's 100% tariffs extra from November 1st and what Beijing has claimed around rare earth and exports, I suspect both of those will be modified in some kind of agreement. Some kind of restraints will remain, though. It's quite clear we're not going back to the situation even of the first administration of President Trump. And if I could just add, I think one thing that Washington has underestimated is actually the influence and power that China can now wield. I think it's very different from the first Trump administration. And it's also very different because at that time, I think China was still looking more to integrate into the global economy on global terms. I think now with Mr. He Lifeng and President Xi, they have a very different attitude. I think they feel we have a model, the model works, we're prioritizing security, we want to make sure that we develop our indigenous technology, and I think they're proving much, much tougher negotiators than was the case in the first Trump administration.
So in the competition between China and the U.S. Over resources and technology controls you just mentioned, whose countermeasures have been more effective right now?
Well, we don't really know about China's countermeasures because they're only being announced. They've not really started yet, but they would create a dramatic change for many countries in terms of their capabilities for production of high tech. So they really have a strong card that they can play with that. For President Trump, I think China learned from the first administration. It's diversified its export markets. It's built up its own internal capacities. And I think probably as a result, President Trump's moves around tariffs have been less effective than Washington imagined. And I think China's been better able to protect itself. Having said that, though, it still could have a major damaging effect for China's economy, especially at a time when the Chinese economy is slowing down, when real estate has ended effectively, when youth unemployment is growing. It has a lot of domestic challenges, which is why I think President Xi now keeps talking about security, securitization of the economy.
So we all also knew that on October 14th, both China and the U.S. started imposing reciprocal port fees, and as trade tensions now extend into maritime and port charges, do you think that this marked a return to a form of geopolitical rivalry between a land power and a maritime power right now?
Well, that's hard to assess. I'm not sure it's a challenge between a land power and a maritime power. Because if you look at the developments, China is now expanding quite rapidly as a maritime force, both in terms of its container supplies. It's really in many ways outdoing America now in terms of supply chains, container shipping and so forth. And of course it's now also increasing dramatically its own military naval capacities. So I think what we're really seeing is not necessarily between a land power and a maritime power. We're really seeing an old-fashioned geopolitical struggle between two of the most significant, powerful nations in the world.
And in the U.S. and China trade war right now, what factors are most likely to force one side to compromise? Maybe it's, you just mentioned the economy pressure, or maybe political, public opinion, or political pressure. What's your opinion?
Well, I don't think the Chinese leadership suffer too much from public opinion, which is going to make them shift. I think China has been quite clever and strategic in terms of the way it's been hitting at the US economy, for example, particularly US farmers. And it did this also in the first Trump administration, which might build up pressure on the government in Washington to shift its position. I think ultimately, though, there's got to be a recognition on both sides that they can only go so far with what I see in many ways as a kind of childish game. You know, if you do this to me, I'll do this to you. If you do this, I'll do that. And it just escalates. And we all know that with two schoolyard bullies, it usually ends up in an awful fight that nobody really wins from. So I think ultimately, to come back to what I said earlier, this is really only going to be resolved if President Xi and President Trump sit down together and hash out some framework. Now, both countries thought they had agreed that framework in the 4 sets of talks they had, including those in Stockholm and Madrid. And now both sides are accusing the other of breaking it. You know, the US is saying, well, China's broken it because of rare earths. And China's saying it because of some of these things around port fees and other things. So there's the blame game, and ultimately no one is going to win from that blame game.
And you said it's a childish game, but which side do you think is more likely to yield in the current round of confrontation, and why?
That is so difficult to answer, to be quite honest. I think China is probably in a stronger position than many imagined it would be. And I think Washington thought, going right back to the start of this 145% tariffs, that they would sort of wave these threats and Beijing would cave. And it hasn't. So I think, the US is in a less favorable position than it hoped to be. And I think that means it will have to climb down. It's not going to say that publicly, of course, but it will have to make some kinds of concessions to get reciprocal concessions from Beijing.
So could this round of trade disputes lead to changes in global supply chains? Or maybe we have already seen that a lot of things change in global supply chains or international trade rules?
I think you're right. I mean, if you look at global supply chains, they've transformed dramatically. I think there's no doubt now that China is really the linchpin of most global supply chains. And they've put themselves in a position where many countries economically, trading-wise, are reliant far more on China than they are in the United States of America. United States of America still retains the kind of security remit, if you like, but even that might be weakening over time as President Trump doesn't respect so much traditional allies, doesn't see those kinds of alliances as important. So I think you're right. We've seen already, actually, the major shift in global supply chains has shifted. I don't think we've seen fully the geopolitical ramifications of that, but certainly if over time more and more economies get tied into Chinese networks, Chinese supply chains, that will have an effect on geopolitics and may well strengthen Beijing's hand. However, I'm just going to say, this kind of brings us back to the question of rare earths. There's also the possibility that Beijing could overplay its hand. And if it does that, it might then lose the credibility that it's trying to build up for itself, saying we are the responsible players on the global stage.
Yeah, so if rare earths, tariffs, and maritime power all become normalized instruments of competition, where do you see the future of US-China economic relations heading to?
Well, they're always going to be troubled. I mean, I think the administration and previously, they've tried to get away from this phrase of decoupling. I mean, I think everybody who has a realistic assessment knows that you cannot decouple the economies. You can de-link, and you can you can do what they call de-risking, but decoupling is impossible. So where does that leave us? I think we have to look at different sectors. I think in terms of trade, it will decline, but it won't diminish entirely. I think in terms of US businesses in China, they still want access to those markets, so in as far as they can, they will still invest, they will try and sell products within that market. if you look at global financial markets, it's a $5 trillion business. They can't really detach from that without causing global crisis. The key area, though, where I think the future battle is going to be waged is over who controls the new technologies of the future.
So right now, President Trump keeps saying that he's going to meet President Xi in South Korea, but China never confirmed this event. And are you optimistic about that Trump is going finally to meet President Xi and they will kind of finally come to an end or come to a conclusion?
Well, President Trump says he will, then he says he won't, then he says, well, we're both going to be there, so I guess we should. It does seem as if some kind of negotiations are going on for preparation. I think Beijing has been pretty firm. Remember, they have a big Communist Party meeting coming up. The last thing President Xi Jinping wants to appear is weak in front of US pressure, so he's got to look strong. Not giving an answer is a way of appearing strong because it makes it look like, oh, President Trump is coming to me, I'm not going to him. So I think that sort of is a signal of I'm in power. He wants to talk to me more than I want to talk to him. Having said all that, it does seem to me improbable, but not impossible. Anything's possible, that if they're both in Korea and they don't meet, that really would be extraordinary. If they don't meet, I don't know what happens. We're in for a real mess.
And also I'm quite curious about the differences between, you just mentioned He Lifeng, the kind of China trade representative I'm confronting right now with the U.S. Trade Representative Greer. What's the differences between these two guys that make things change a lot compared to 6 years ago when Trump's first term in office?
Well, I think in the first term of office they were negotiating with Liu He,
yes.
And I think at that time Xi Jinping hadn't really focused on what he calls the securitization of the economy. I think they were still more kind of open to engagement on global terms. And so I think it was an easier set of discussions and easier bargains. I think what has happened since then, though, is that Xi Jinping has refocused the Chinese economy, not only just in terms of what I talked about, securitization, but secondly in terms of protecting indigenous innovation and making the country less dependent on the West for technological advances. Then you combine that with the fact that he talks about the new development concept, which is very much a state-dominated, state-directed approach to the economy to try and produce what he calls about the new quality productive forces. That's a very different mindset, I think. And I think it's a mindset that thinks what we're doing is right, that it works, and that our levels of state control and oversight of the economy are the correct things. That to me is a very different mindset for someone like He Lifeng than what we saw in the first Trump administration. And I think it's taking Washington a while to understand that that shift has taken place within the Chinese leadership.
Yeah, and I remember you mentioned on a CNBC show that rare earths is not that rare.
No.
Pakistan has rare earth materials.
Yeah.
Other countries have rare earth materials, but right now China is almost the only country that control the whole industry of the rare earth materials processing.
Yeah.
And do you think that's going to change in the near-term future?
Immediate terms, no, because this takes a long time to build up. China was able to develop rare earths processing capabilities from the mid-1990s onwards because it didn't care about a lot of the externalities, the pollution of it, the filth of production, and gave a lot of state support to it. Whereas if you look around a lot of the rest of the world, America basically closed down its rare earth processing factory because it didn't seem as though it was making money. There was a lot of constraints around pollution, environmental regulations, and so forth. And that's really what allowed China to get to where it's really processing 90%. And as you said, rare earths aren't rare, they're everywhere. What is rare is processing them. And now the rest of the world is waking up to the fact that it does need to be processing So America has reopened its plant, Australia is talking about it. But you know, that means they're years behind China. So even it's going to have to invest. So it will change, but this is going to take a number of years before they can get up to the production levels required.
And I think some kind of media outlets keep saying that Xi Jinping wants to put pressure on Washington and make Trump or the White House to like show their attitude on Taiwan issue, like on the cross-strait relation within the trade negotiations right now. Do you think that's going to happen?
I really don't know whether it's going to happen. I mean, I don't think any of us know. We all speculate. And it is clear, I think, of course, that what President Xi would like is a different statement from Washington that is much stronger in terms of not accepting independence from Taiwan. That, who knows, that could be part of the deal. And I don't know whether President Trump would really appreciate the significance of making that statement. I suspect some of his advisors, who are much more hawkish on China, might want to hold him back from making that statement. But I go back to what I said at the very beginning. You know, Trump is a deal maker. I think if he feels saying something like that will get him a decent deal on trade and investment, who knows? And certainly it would be a huge plus for Xi Jinping.
You mentioned about some hawkish officials in the Trump administration, and I recall the guy, Secretary Lutnick. Do you think that he played a big role in the U.S.-China trade talk?
I don't think he's played as strong a role as people like Besant and Greer. Yeah, I mean, he plays a role, but I don't think, to be honest, it's been the dominant role. But then Besant has also been pretty negative about China.
Yeah.
Marco Rubio is extremely negative. The current ambassador to Beijing is very hostile in the comments about China. So it's one of the very few things that unites across the political divide in Washington is the concern and fears about China's development and its global aspirations as they are interpreted in Washington.
And the final question I would like to know that what's your personal view of the U.S.-China relationship are going to heading to what kind of phase right now?
It's about as bad as it can be. I think there has to be a bottom at some point. There's always going to be, I think, now friction. There's going to be hostility. There's going to be suspicion. That's not going to go away. Mm-hmm. But if you think about, well, the only way you're going to get an agreement is if it is in the best national interest of the particular country. So I think you have to step back and look at it from that perspective. Are there areas where cooperation is in the national interest of China and is in the national interest of the United States of America? And I think you have to build out from there. And I think there are certain areas, financial regulation, for example, cyber security outside of military issues, even climate change, although President Trump denies climate change, but sooner or later that is going to be an issue. Safety on the oceans, preventing pandemics. I think there's a set of global issues where both countries need one another to meet their own national objectives and interests. So yeah, so trade is always going to have friction. There's always going to be these security issues. There's going to be a fight around new technologies, extension of those new technologies. But I think some areas of cooperation will have to be found for stability.
Okay, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
So you only came from Boston. You didn't come up from Washington.
Yeah, I actually live in Boston originally.
I was just going to say, it was a long way for you to come for an interview, but if you're only coming from Boston, that's not so far.
But we fly from Washington, actually.
Oh, okay. So he had the trouble.
I really like Cambridge. The weather, the people here.
Yeah, you wait till winter.
Yeah. Well, I live in Cambridge from January.
Oh, you did?
Year. Yeah.
Oh, so you got some of the...
It's extremely cold.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We didn't get so much snow last winter.
What?
No,
I think that's enough for me.
No. We've had some snowfalls that like 26, 27 inches.
Oh,
We had, you know, the streets, streets coming up towards the square. One year they had to turn them into one-way streets because there was so much snow. And when I was walking along the pathway, the snow was like this either side of me, where they dug it out. So,
that's
you know,
incredible.
there's more snow to come.
Wow,
All right.
that makes sense.
Let me get my name card for you as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me know if you air any of this.
Yes, of course. I think I can email you a video copy for this interview.
Oh, great,
Yeah.
yeah.